Evelyn is the program director at the University of Houston Coastal Center in Marque since 2019. She initiated the concept of designing the UHCC as the Texas Institute for the Coastal Prairie Research and Education. Evelyn was an active participant in the successful effort for the Texas Legislature to do so in 2017. Having done stuff at the Texas Legislature, that's pretty impressive to get that done. At UHCC, she is responsible for planning and coordinating restoration activities, community outreach, and assisting with the development activities that further the mission of the UHCC and the TICRE. Previously, Evelyn worked in the oil and gas industry and has been active as a volunteer in conservation issues, including flood control planning, public land, and non-game wildlife. She received a BS in biological sciences from New Orleans and an M.B.A. from the University of Houston. Evelyn, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for inviting me to speak at your monthly meeting. I think some of you, I've recognized a number of the names of the participants in the meeting, so I know some of you and some I don't. I know there's a lot of cross membership between the Native Plant Society of your local chapter and the Galveston Bay Texas Master Naturalist, who are regular volunteers at the Coastal Center. So hello to the folks out there with the Texas Master Naturalist who volunteer with us. Nice to have you on the meeting. And it's nice to speak with some of the folks I have not met before. Okay, this is a view of one of our best prairies, the 100-acre almond prairie at the U of H Coastal Center, which is also the home of the Texas Institute for Coastal Prairie Research and Education. Just for those who have not been there before, this is a little bit of orientation. The University of Houston is pretty close to downtown. The central campus is off of Elgin and Cullen, and it's about a half an hour drive, if you have no problems with traffic, to get down to the U of H Coastal Center in Marque, Texas. It is next to where the old Greyhound dog track used to be, near exit 15. And we are located within the Highland Bayou watershed, which is also part of the Galveston Bay watershed. So as you can see, it's not that far from where a number of your members probably live. Before it was the University of Houston Coastal Center, that was before 1940, it was rangeland. Cattle would graze there, and it was also coastal prairie. But the federal government acquired the land that is now the Coastal Center by eminent domain, so shortly before 1940. And on the cattle range, they began to construct an army base that housed more than 10,000 men at a time for training. It was an army facility initially, the Coast Artillery Replacement Training Center. It housed 10,000 plus trainees at a time. There are over 400 buildings on the site. They built 17 miles of road where there were none, made of oyster shell that was dredged from redfish bar, which was not a good thing to do ecologically, but it was the remnant of a barrier reef across Galveston Bay. And at the very top, you can see a view of the Camp Wallace buildings. But what is interesting is even at looking at this particular picture, and I actually have, it's one of those very long photos, you don't really see trees there, do you? Well, it doesn't look the same today, because before it was rangeland, and then the trees were kept down during Camp Wallace, but then after that, things changed. On the left-hand side, you're going to see a little Army Day welcoming brochure, and then near the end of the war, it was transferred to the Navy. It was also housed mostly German prisoners of war. After it was transferred to the Navy, which was shortly before the war ended, then it was converted to what they called a personnel separation center, which is where the sailors were discharged into civilian life. And more than 50,000 sailors were discharged through Camp Wallace at the end of World War II. So post-World War II, it was declared surplus. And all of the buildings were removed, which was sort of easy to do because the vast majority were not built on slabs. They were built on pier and beam, which is the old style way of building homes in a very wet environment, which makes a lot of sense. So we really don't have very many ruins left there, but we do have the oyster shell roads. And what's interesting is if you look at the map on the bottom left, that was the reverse side of that little Army Day brochure. And at the upper right, you're going to see a current aerial Google map. And take a look at the orientation of those of the lines, which are the roads. This is the old Army Day map. These days, you enter from over here on the east side from FM 2004. The old entry was actually over here from Highway 6, and that was the main entrance. Every road had a name. But take a look at this big rectangle right here, okay? Which also extends to the south. Also take a look, this is north. All the roads were laid out on a strict north, south, east, west axis, which is, very easy to now know exactly what direction you're looking in. But this rectangle right here was the parade ground. It was never disturbed. Nothing was ever built on it. It has never been plowed. It is now this area right here. It's about 100 acres. And it's the almond prairie, which is one of our very best prairies. It has never been disturbed. It's virgin prairie, never been plowed. The areas to the south of it, right here, correspond to this area here. We are busy doing restoration on the areas here and here. And you remember that earlier photo, that long photo that showed that there were no trees? Well, there are no trees up in here. But this represents what I was always calling the 5-acre tallow wart. And it became invaded by woody brush, a great deal of which is tallow trees. But the road layout is exactly the same as it was back when it was Camp Wallace. But we have actually been able to easily use these roads as fire breaks, and it makes it a lot easier to get our equipment around. Well, after it was declared surplus and the buildings were removed around 1960, the University of Houston received the first parcel. And actually, when it was first transferred to the University of Houston, the university got close to 1,700 acres, not the 925 acres it is these days. But the university turned over the other adjacent land, which is now a county park, Jack Brooks County Park. But at one point in time, Jack Brooks is now over in this area right here. So by 1972, the current configuration of 925 acres was established. So the key things to remember about what we have now is that we have a slice of the Gulf Coast prairie at the landscape level, and we're trying to increase that amount by restoration. We have the almond prairie. And when we were going before the Texas Legislature, and we had the bill to try and designate it as the Texas Institute for Coastal Prairie Research and Education, we did get letters of support from Texas Parks and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife attesting to the value of the property as coastal prairie. That it is not only coastal prairie now, it also has some wetlands, but all of our wetlands are man-made. The picture that you see here is one of our shallower wetland areas. It's around 5 acres in size, but it really enhances the habitat diversity of the property, because what do wildlife need? They need water, especially with the type of weather that is becoming more common today. And also because it does the actual diversity of habitats on the property does increase our biodiversity of the types of plants that we support. At this time, we have over 400 species of plants that have been identified at the Coastal Center. To become the Texas Institute, we thought that this would be really good for the university and also to establish in the public's eye how valuable the assets that we had there were, and to give it a name. Everything does better with a name, doesn't it? The UH Coastal Center was great, but it did not really point out how important the coastal prairie on the property was. Designating it as the Institute solidified that. And it also gave us a new focus. Before, it had simply been a field station for the University of Houston, used for different types of projects. But we went beyond research when it was established as the Institute. We wanted to focus not only on research, which is, of course, important to any university, but also for restoration and education statewide, with our goal of becoming a regional and national hub. And we also wanted to serve the local community. So when we started on our journey to restoration, which really took off after we were designated the Institute and things started to get into gear in 2018, we found that using historical maps really helped us to guide restoration. If you're looking at something that is covered over by tallow trees, you have no idea what is underneath it or what used to be underneath it, how the soil would be. We knew that the area of the almond prairie had never been plowed and that it was some of our best prairie, but what had everything else been, and what effect did it have on the soil structure and just, anything that might be lurking just underneath the soil. So we found, by making friends with the Santa Fe Area Historical Foundation, that they had maps that we did not have, and we didn't know they existed. They had aerial photos. They had, besides the little welcome map that I showed you before that showed the road orientation, and the almond prairie was exactly the same as what the parade ground was in the 1940s. We found very detailed maps from 1945 showing the exact location of every structure that had been built on Old Camp Wallace and where there were no structures. Those aerial maps also showed us areas of where the oyster shell had been in the 1940s. And we used those maps to prioritize what we're going to try and restore first. Taking a look at one of these old topo maps, you can see, as I mentioned before, we're in the Highland Bayou watershed. This is from circa 1940 topo map. And as you can see, there is Camp Wallace and a U.S. military reservation. You can see the Highway 6 and the original entrance into Camp Wallace. And of course, here is the almond prairie and the big parade ground. We actually have an old newspaper clipping showing a photo that's captioned 10,000 men pass in review at Camp Wallace. And that was on our parade ground. Here you can see on the topo map all the different buildings, but it's not nearly as detailed as the 1945 map. But here you can see where basically no buildings were. So the first thing you might think is, when I'm doing restoration, I'm going to concentrate on the places where they didn't have buildings, because that's going to be the low-hanging fruit, which is good as far as it goes. And this is a survey map showing the same street layouts. And you can also see the 1942 map. Again, everything basically laid out the same. And this is the 1945 map showing exactly where all the buildings were. The actual map is sort of like 3 by 4 feet. We have a good copy of it mounted on foam board at the Coastal Center that is much larger. But what is even more interesting is that every one of these little buildings has a number, and we have an index so we know exactly what buildings were where. This particular map that shows green shows where we've identified historic remains, which we're also trying to be respectful of, because this is a snapshot in time that a lot of important historic things happened here. A lot of men trained here in World War II. This also shows here, this was where the prisoner of war camp was. And today, our lab, when you come in the gate right here off of FM 2004, our lab is right about right here, our lab building. But over here we have water tower remains, and what a lot of people enjoy is the old War Department Theater, which was the old 2-story movie theater. The top part is gone, but all the bottom remains, which is now holding water and used by some of the classes to do some of their water testing studies. Remember I said that the low-hanging fruit would be to, first of all, to work on restoring the areas that didn't have anything built on it, which is correct. However, There's another thing. Remember, I mentioned that they laid out 17 miles of oyster shell roads, which is everything you see right here. Well, they not only laid out roads with 10,000 soldiers training here. Of course, you have all of your equipment, and you have equipment yards and maintenance. All of the areas here, right here, that seem to be white. Here's where there is the old War Department Theater. You see the white here? Those were the parking lots and the driveways. So you know in these areas, they are going to be much more difficult to restore because right underneath the trees and the brush is a layer of oyster shell. So this also helps us. We can actually use our resources more efficiently by using these old historical maps. So what are our goals? When we started out doing our restoration, we could go from prairie unit to prairie unit and go to this field and to that field. And in between the fields, what you saw were tall tallow trees and a lot of brush. You really didn't see the prairie on the landscape scale. So what we started to do was to work on prioritizing connectivity. We wanted to connect prairie unit to prairie unit and prairie to wetland areas. Even though they're man-made, they're very valuable habitat. We wanted to remove the undesirable seed sources. Of course, that includes the tallow, but also the unwelcome grass species like vasi grass, which we are more recently having a problem with, and the issues of Chinese privet, Chinese ligustrum. And we have also found that we have a problem with some of our native species, such as yaupon and wax myrtle, which are wonderful native species. They provide food and shelter for wildlife, but they can actually start taking over and actually creating yaupon mottes, which are little shrubs themselves, and crowding out everything. So we have to manage that as well. We wanted to also improve the access for maintenance so we could get our mowers in there, because one of the problems with having to deal with a tallow tree is that we're able to keep it in control by a combination of mowing, spot herbiciding, and prescribed burning. And the maintenance is important to get the mowers in there. When you're dealing with an area like we do, where we've been working on getting rid of first of all, the tallow, quite frankly, that's been most of our emphasis, is that the seed is already in the soil. So if we don't either mow or spot herbicide or burn in a year, the tallow starts to come back. It'll take quite a few years before we get rid of a lot of the seed that's just in the seed bank. So these are our main restoration goals that we have going on right now, and it guides our work. When we are doing restoration, if you're looking at the top, this is what these areas that look like that they were no longer sort of a yellow color indicating grassland, this is what it looks like. We're looking at trees that are reasonably tall. And we also look at the area down here at the bottom right. This is an area that could not be mowed for some year. They had problems before we started getting on the right track with the equipment and with rain, and I think a lot of equipment problems. When you look at the brown right here, that's actually tallow that has been sprayed with a backpack sprayer. It was 4 or 5 feet tall. It had gotten to the point that we could not handle it with the mower. Our mowers were not strong enough to handle it. It had to be sprayed. So this shows what can happen in just 2 or 3 years if you're not maintaining an area. Our treatment of the woody brush really depends upon the stem and the trunk diameter and its height. This area down here that was 4 or 5 feet tall, we couldn't mow, but a backpack mower with a person basically on a ground crew could handle it. When you're looking at this, a ground crew cannot handle that. It's just too tall. You're looking at things that are 20 and 30 feet tall, and you can't even get the equipment in there except from just do the perimeter of the road. When we are doing work that we can do with a ground crew, we generally will do either foliar spraying or a cut stump method or a hack and squirt method. Girdling is generally done with a larger tree, but we do try to use triclopyr, which is very effective against tallow. I try not to use a non-selective herbicide. I try to use selective herbicide. The density can also give you a choice of whether you use a ground crew or you go to mechanical means, meaning that you actually have machines that will grind down the woody brush. Also, the contiguous acreage. If you have something like this, that is acres and acres of tall trees, then you could go to aerial application, which could be very effective, other than trying to get a ground crew in there, which is almost impossible, or else getting a mulching machine, which is also very expensive as the first pass. Another thing to think of when you're deciding what method will I use is what type of money do I have? What is my budget? Because if you're going to use a mechanical means, some of the larger mulching machines, they are expensive. They can be $2,200 to $2,400 a day. That can eat up a budget quickly, but they are quicker than a ground crew. When you're using a ground crew, the advantage is that when you use a machine like this and you're grinding everything down, it doesn't spray the stump. And it's absolutely certain it is going to resprout. And that is when you really need to do a foliar spray on the resprout or else do a cut stump method when it comes back again. To give you an idea, this is one of the larger machines. These were trees that were 20, 30 to 35 feet tall and a fringe of woody brush around the almond prairie. This is how it works. If you can see the flat green area beyond, that is the almond prairie. This was a strip all along the eastern edge of the almond prairie, which completely blocked the prairie off. That's how that machine works. That's one of the more expensive machines. But take a look at what the ground looks like in the foreground. Do you see how coarse this is? Because you can't get a very fine shred with this type of machine. And indeed, this is only the first step. This is such a coarse mulch right here. And this, by the way, is the almond prairie over just on the other side of this long, very long strip. We also had to put in a smaller mulching machine to go over it. And then we had to wait a year and then send the machine out again, a second mulching. And then we did a prescribed burn, which was, we are very much indebted to the Marque Fire Department and some of their other folks for doing this, because this has basically got us to the point where we could use a mower, our own mower, to manage this area, which before was solid mass, a solid line of woody brush, which not only was a source of constant invasive species seed dropping into the prairie, it blocked the view of the prairie, it blocked access. We had limited access to the prairie because of this long strip. Of course, what we are learning right now, unfortunately, is that, you almost sometimes have a wave of invasive species. We got rid of tallow, ligustrum, privet, everything here, but we're dealing with a problem with vacey grass. So it never ends. Then we have one of our biggest problems in the middle of our best prairie. we had a 5-acre, what I call the tallow wart, in our middle of our very, very best prairie. I had understood it was left there as an example of what would happen if we didn't mow every year. Well, I wish they had picked another area, because this has been a job. Since this really was our very best prairie and it had been undisturbed, we wanted to avoid the heavy equipment. So we had a ground crew in there. And we also tried to learn from one of our previous prescribed burns, in which we had killed a very, very large tallow tree. It was very dead, all gray and no leaves, very dry. It should have burned, except that when you set a prescribed burn in a prairie, which is dominated by grass, the grass burns very quickly and it just keeps on going. And the wood, the brush, the dead tallow tree wood never caught on fire. So this time we took advice. We tried to learn from our past burns. So what we did is, all up in here, we had 2 sets of controls. First time earlier in the summer, we cut all the woody brush, the yaupon, the wax myrtle, everything that was small, everything that wasn't a tallow tree, because the tallow is most responsive to the selective herbicide when it's about to go dormant. And that means late August or sometime in September. So earlier in the summer, we left everything that we cut piled up so that it would provide a fuel source for a fire as it came through, and burn longer, so that eventually, we hoped, it would then catch the dead tallow on fire. Later on in the summer, every one of the trees was girdled and sprayed with herbicide into the girdled area only, leaving everything upright. So this year, we had a prescribed burn in March, and we burned the entire 100 acres of the almond prairie again. And if you look up in here, you can see the skeletons of trees. That was the tallow wart. Everything had been killed. We had all of the brush piled up. Here you can see it also right here with the fire advancing. The plan is that all of the brush would increase the residence time of the fire, giving it a chance to catch the dead skeletons of the trees on fire. Well, that was the theory. And this is after the burn. Well, what happened? This was very bad news, after all of our preparation. So we analyzed the situation, and what had happened this year. In the spring, if you recall, we had huge amounts of rain in the Marque area, which is fine, except that it also delayed our burning. What we found is that by the time we were able to get, and it was the very first day of this year that was good for us, was near the beginning of March, when we had the correct wind direction, and it wasn't raining when we had the correct north or northwest wind. Earlier in the year, every time we had a north or a northwest wind, we got a load of rain with it. Well, that load of rain really impacted all of those nice piles of woody brush that were supposed to increase the residence time of the fire. After it went through and we saw what had not happened, the fire crews went in and said, we just walked in there and you could just feel the dampness. So it would not catch on fire. So we're basically licking our wounds and figuring out the next step. But at least the tallow trees are dead now. Okay, after the fire, which was on March the 7th, as you can tell, this was a very good burn, with the exception of the tallow trees, okay? The tallow wart. In less than a month, on the right-hand side, that's what it looked like on March 27th. It had completely greened up. And you had to actually walk out on the prairie and look down at your feet in some areas to see anything that remained of the blackened vegetation from the burn. Over here, by the way, that is part of the tallow wart that didn't burn. In a healthy prairie, when it is burned, it comes right back. And as a matter of fact, you can start to see the first green sprouts within a week. So in addition to our prescribed burning treatment, we do have prairie maintenance, and we use that with spot herbicide, lopping shears, usually a cut stump method, and applying herbicide directly to a cut stem. also implemented a cycle of prescribed burning. This is actually the first burn we ever did at the Almond Prairie when we reinvigorated our burn program. This is an aerial view of the prairie burning. We have had a lot of progress since we restarted the program in 2020. We have burned every year. At this point, we've had 4 prescribed burns. It was starting out with the Almond Prairie, burning another 50 or 60 acres the next year. And then another area, these were all areas, most of them had never been burned before, with the exception of almond some years ago. And then we burned the Almond Prairie again for a second time this year, and the Tallow Wart. So overall, we've burned around 200 or more acres since we reinvigorated our burning program. We've burned basically a good 200 acres of the 925. And as the rest of it undergoes restoration, we're going to implement burning on it, and we are doing it on a 3-year burn cycle. This is an aerial view of the fire on the Almond Prairie, showing basically all of this area here, and it'll continue burning. It was burned in thirds the first time. It'll keep on going down here, but this is what we're dealing with respect to tallow right here. Okay, and the goal is, these are some of the plants that we have. This is yellow Indian grass and the lady's tresses, which is going to come a little bit later on in the year. Sugarcane plume grass. We have some of the, I think that's the swamp sunflower, the rattlesnake master, which we have in abundance there. And of course, obedient plant, Physostegia. And this is just a eupatorium, the goldenrod, and some of the swamp sunflower. And that is our goal, is to have a very healthy prairie with great biodiversity. So far, our restoration progress is that we returned approximately 100 acres to active coastal management since 2018. And that was just by, cutting it, shredding it. That's the heavier equipment, spot herbicide and mowing. We started another 100 acres last September, and that was doing aerial spraying by helicopter. This was of the tall, dense tallow areas where we had tall enough trees, dense enough, and a big enough areas that a helicopter could be used. It was the first use of aerial herbicide at U of H, and we prioritized those areas to try to improve connectivity. So at this point, we have a little bit over 200 acres managed under active management, and then another 100 acres that we started last year with the aerial spraying. These are some interesting photos showing what happened last year. We did some intensive work on around 15 acres with the skid mulcher and the ground crew. When we did the aerial spraying, it was done at daybreak because the winds are better then. The things you really want to be careful about is drift. Whenever you do herbicide spraying, but especially when you're using aerial spraying, is drift, unintended drift. This is the equipment that's used. It looks like the helicopter is about to go straight into the ditch, but it didn't. It lands on top of this nurse truck or service truck, and it lands repeatedly on this truck to get new fuel and new herbicide and water mixture. And then it starts, when it takes off, it goes down, and then it goes up and flies on a grid that is GPS controlled. This is a close-up view of actually when they were loading the tanks up with the herbicide mixture the day before. And this shows the helicopter being serviced on top of its support vehicle. To make sure that they can actually do correct coverage, what it is that all of the coordinates are loaded into a computer program. And when the helicopter takes off and it makes its first run, it does it in straight lines. It flies a straight line, turns around, matches it up on a grid on the computer screen inside the helicopter with where its last line of flight was. Once it gets lined up, then it does another line of application until it runs out of herbicide. Then it lands here again, refills its tanks with the herbicide and water mixture with also some surfactant to make it stick, and takes off again. These are the areas that we did with our spraying. We used, for those who are interested, Alligator Imox. It's the generic version of a very effective herbicide that was used at Sheldon Lake State Park on their tallow. at a rate of about 10 gallons per acre. That we did not do this area or the area over here. They were handled by other means, but everything else, which is totaled around 100 acres, we did with the helicopter. It could just fly straight lines, and it did the same thing here. One of the things that could be really difficult is when you're spraying, when the trees are about to go into dormancy, you don't know how successful it is. So it's a real nail biter. But it turns out that this spring was not actually until this spring that we knew that it had been successful, because you don't know if the leaves are gone simply because they went dormant or whether your spraying was successful. However, it was great. You see all these dead gray skeletons? Those would have been green tallow trees in the spring. That meant that it was successful. Likewise here, you can see these green trees. Well, the reason that those still look green is because they really aren't tallow trees, and this was really targeted at the tallow. But the vast majority, all these gray skeletons, were all a huge amount of tallow trees in 28 acres. And that was only the first step, of course, because now we need to get in brush management to start taking these things down. So whenever you see this line of gray, that meant it was successful, and we were extremely pleased. As part of what we're doing, when we became the Institute, we really went into community outreach. But we thought that was important so that people just, for one thing, knew that we were out there. A lot of people, even at the University of Houston, don't know that we exist still, but even less people knew we existed beforehand. We established a 10-member technical advisory committee. It's from both state and federal agencies and also from nonprofits that we confer with and basically get their input on some questions we have on restoration, such as, how many trees do we really want to leave out here on the prairie that are good oak trees, or what would be the percentage that we want to leave. We collaborate with Texas Parks and Wildlife as part of the restoration and as part of the technical advisory committee. Without the City of Lamarque Fire Department and other fire departments in the area, we would not be able to do our burn program, because they use what we have, our areas out there that need to be burned, as a training exercise for them, and it really benefits us. We also have volunteers that have come out helping us with brush control from the Texas Master Naturalist, and also during our prescribed burns from Armand Bayou Nature Center, the Natural Sciences and Mathematics College at U of H from their alumni association, and volunteer groups. We were also a site, one of the conference tour sites in 2019 for the North American Prairie Conference tour that came to Houston that year. We are a seed collection site and have been for the Memorial Park Conservancy and for the Texas Master Naturalist. I know that some of the seed has been germinated over at Armand Bayou Nature Center as well. We started the monthly bird surveys by the Audubon Society to get a better idea of what wildlife we have there in the late spring of 2021. We started an annual forum with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. We co-host them. And also the previous year with the Nature Conservancy's Texas City Preserve on a practitioners forum for coastal prairie restoration aimed at the people who make decisions on how to restore prairie. And we've also done outreach to the Galveston County Historical Commission and the local historical foundation, which is where we got those wonderful maps that has helped us in guiding our restoration decisions. We also have an eye to the future. And one of those is a grant that's going to partially fund the construction of a greenhouse on the site that we can use for both research and plant propagation. This is a drawing. It would be a 30 by 50 foot greenhouse, and we're working on plans for that right now. And our other projects, of course, I have the greenhouse at the top, but also the growing fields. One of the things we did with the skid mulcher was prepare doing the first pass on a 4-acre site that will be the growing fields next to the future site of the greenhouse. We've also started propagation of native milkweed, working with the Texas Master Naturalist. And we've chosen that we're going to start concentrating on 4 species, the viridis, the linearis, and perennis. These are seeds we've collected either on FM 2004 or on the U of H Coastal Center website, and verticillata we're still working on trying to get. Our other plans that we are discussing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Natural Resources Conservation Service is enhancing the wetlands on the property so that they will be so much more valuable for the wildlife that comes there and give us an even better diverse habitat in addition to the coastal prairie. We truly want to be a mosaic of forested and non-forested wetland and coastal prairie. We are going to be continuing with our annual practitioners forum with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And of course, we bit off 100 acres using the aerial herbicide spraying last year, and we're having to follow up with brush control. And usually with this, the plan is to use the heavy equipment, heavy machinery for the next step. And then controlling invasive grass, which is now decided that it loves to follow up on tallow. And we have also received a grant recently to prepare a strategic plan for the site, which we think is going to be really important to trying to decide how we want to present ourselves to the public and how to become better known, as well as look at what we want to do for funding in the future, the various options, and how to actually develop the site so that we maximize the restoration work and the opportunity for research in a natural area while having a better physical plant so that it be more appropriate for study and for inviting the public in to see it. Just in case, I thought I should throw this in about what the benefits of a healthy coastal prairie are. The almond prairie does have particular merit because it can be used as a standard, a sort of a gold standard by which you can measure the success of other restorations because it is such a diverse prairie. Some of the other advantages of healthy coastal prairie, both to the environment and that includes the human environment as well, is that the deep-rooted plants, which provide better infiltration of water into the soil, allow rainfall to basically flow more slowly over the landscape, storing the rainfall or a portion of it, absorbing it, instead of a quick overland flow into receiving streams. It provides better erosion control so that soil does not wash out. It has a much better, the non-native ground covers that you often see have very shallow root systems, and they are certainly not very diverse. And the coastal prairies, as you can see, are well adapted to withstand fire, but they also do a better job of surviving periodic drought. Last year, that we had sort of a mini drought, and everyone was saying, where is the water? Where we wish we had better rain. Our prairie did develop cracks. It was so dry. However, once we received water, the plants sprouted up almost immediately, flowered, and set seed. They were affected by the drought. They were not as tall as we've seen them other years, but they were able, because of their deep root systems and the density of these plants, they survived the drought and came right back again. And of course, the floods, they can withstand those as well. The biodiversity of a healthy coastal prairie is good for wildlife, not only pollinators and monarchs. We have a good population of milkweed there, by the way, but also resident and migratory birds. And of course, they're not only the monarchs, but other pollinator species find it to be a very valuable source of food and shelter. We are a seed source for future prairie restorations. And of course, what is becoming more apparent today is that the coastal prairies can fix carbon in the soil, actually is stored deeper in the soil because of their root systems. Trees store carbon in their trunks, and prairie plants store it in the soil. That is what I've put together for tonight's presentation. We do have a website that we upgraded last year. And if you don't want to write down the website address here, you can just go to Google and put in UH Coastal Center, and you will come to our website. And about a month and a half ago, we started a new Instagram account, and that's out there too.
How did you get started? I mean, you talk about how you got the land, but there's a lot of money involved, and obviously you have to be very tenacious to do this project. And then what is the University of Houston? How do they support you?
The restoration work that we have done so far at the Coastal Center has been done with a combination of grants from private foundations, from individual donor grants, and also from a corporate grant and government grants. We are always working on grants. The university does not really fund the restoration. They do support a good part of the basic operating expenses of the Coastal Center. And that is a big change, because before it was designated the Institute, it was basically in a caretaking mode. The only thing that got done was mowing, and prescribed burning was done rarely. I think before about 2017 or 2018, the last burn that had been done there was once on the Almond Prairie when someone wanted to do a study, but there was no regular program. There was no systematic, nothing was systematic. The only type of actual maintenance that was done was the mowing. There was no spot herbiciding, there was no prescribed fire program, and a lot of the equipment was getting old. So the turning point was really when we started working on the Institute.
Yeah, you said that in your talk. And lots of people have said wonderful things about your talk. One of them was about your seed collection. Is this hand collected, and how is this stored and distributed?
The seed has been collected by hand. Usually the people that have come out there, I know Jim Doron, I'm sure that there's a number of people out there in the Ethernet somewhere that know Jim Doron. He works with the plant propagation and the greenhouse program at Armand Bayou Nature Center. He regularly comes out there in the fall to collect seed, but he's looking for particular types of certain species. And I think they store their seed over at the Armand Bayou Nature Center. What we have done is that we started collecting milkweed seed, and it's almost being put automatically into, it's being kept in a cool area in a paper bag, because we plan to start all the seed we've collected so far. And I'm working with Chris Anastas. I know that she's a member of your group, but also of the Texas Master Naturalist. And she has a lot of experience with germinating milkweed seed. So I'm working with her. We started putting some viridis and the linearis in vermiculite last week. And the first batch is coming out of the cold, moist storage stratification in the fridge in about 5 weeks. And it's going to be put in trays. We're going to start some of the Pinaris tomorrow. Yeah, we're starting that one, some of those tomorrow in trays, because it doesn't need the cold, moist stratification.
A question came in about how hot it is out there and how do you take care of the people?
It can get extremely hot out there. At a time like now, when it is so incredibly hot, you start thinking, the prairie could use a few more trees. And we are leaving a few scattered live oaks out there for that very reason, because, oak trees are a great source of food and shelter. You certainly increase your diversity of pollinators, and the mast is a great source of food. We do have the lab building that is air conditioned with bathrooms, of course, and we have some trees around the lab building. Also, whenever we work out there, we have cold water and cold drinks for people. We are working with the Texas Master Naturalist out there, but we work in the mornings, and we basically close up shop, after about anywhere between 2 and 3 hours out, because we're not used to working out there in that heat.
Yeah, very few of us are. What is the advantage with the greenhouse, considering that it's pretty hot here?
It allows a more controlled environment. We're looking at having not only hose connections out there, but also a watering system, because, unless you have someone actually living at the coastal center or else coming out there every day in this type of heat, you need to water your plants in pots every day, as you can imagine. So having it in a greenhouse with a watering system would be helpful, that you can at least rely on that if you're away for a weekend. Also, we would be able to use that for more controlled environments for any research that's being done on plant propagation or plant.
Well, We know a lot about greenhouses and growing plants, so it'd be nice to have a good interaction with you so we can learn from each other, I think.
I think that we are always trying to do additional outreach to our colleagues who are also interested in native plants.
This last question here, poison ivy has proven to be a bigger problem for me than the heat, but others have got rashes as well. I've had a lot of problems with poison ivy too. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm also allergic. And I have some here at my house or where I live on Sims Bayou. And no matter what I do, the poison ivy seems to find its way to my skin, no matter how many layers I put on. It's transmitted by perspiration, I think. I always wear gloves, long sleeves. We have some people working with us who are not allergic. Unfortunately, I am, but you try to use these wipes or the special poison ivy soap, and also always watching where when I'm cutting something, because we do have poison ivy there, as you can imagine. It's a native plant, and using tools to try and help move the plant that I've cut instead of using even my gloved hand, because I think over time it always brushes up against your sleeve and then it's transmitted through the perspiration right to your skin.
Yeah, well, I've had pull out a lot of poison ivy, but you're right. I actually wear rubber gloves. I don't even use my gardening gloves.
I wear leather gloves.
Oh, leather would work too.
Yeah, except that the plant somehow knows that it wants to touch your clothing above the glove.
It's a native plant and it really is pretty, but boy, getting those rashes is not great.
It does have wildlife value, and I guess that's
Yes.
its only saving grace is that it has wildlife value.
Somebody wanted to know about the naming of almond prairie.
Oh, yes. Dr. Glenn Aumann, who is now deceased, was a former provost of the university. He was a professor of biology at the Central Campus. And when I first became acquainted with the Coastal Center, it was back in the 1990s when I became interested in using native grasses instead of some of the grasses that were in the seed mixes that were put out by the Harris County Flood Control District and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on our bayous. In the seed mix, they had all these invasive plants, and I was interested in what are the native species, and we were trying to do some testing with native grass species. So that's when I first went out there, and I found that Dr. Aumann was out there, and he really loved that place. He was never happier than when he was riding a mower around at the Coastal Center doing one of their mowings of the almond prairie or one of the other fields that were still in pretty good condition. And since he was in many ways a protector of the area, and he made sure that it got funding as long as he was at the university, and he loved it so much, we thought that we would name the best prairie after him, because I think he's one of the reasons why we still have it today. Yep. And oh, by the way, the picture here, this is, of course, of Liatris pycnostachya and also of snow on the prairie. And this is a picture that was taken at the Coastal Center after a year in which we had a burn at this particular site. Anyone who has actually been active in prairies for some years knows that in the season following a prescribed burn, the blooming of the Liatris is absolutely spectacular.
It is. It is. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation.